Thank you all for joining us. I would like to start my question with General Petraeus about this key central question for most Kurds right now. After the partial withdrawal of US forces in Syria and basically allowing Turkey to come in and attack the Kurds. Many Kurds in Iraq now asking, will this happen to us too? Given that we are now getting used to surprise move by this administration. Based on your experience and your knowledge of the national security apparatus, do you think the Kurds in Iraq should expect a move like this too?
I don't think so. And first of all, let me just say what a privilege it is to be here with Stefan, Tom, and Bernard. Second, at the end of the day, the Kurds do have friends other than the mountains. When I served first in northern Iraq, when we moved up there in late April of 2003 and immediately went to Erbil and Suli and Dahuk, I was told many times that, General, you need to understand that the only friends the Kurds have are these mountains around us. And I said, no, that's not the case. You have your American friends. We had shed blood together at that time already. We did that many, many more times over the ensuing nearly now 2 decades. And I think at the end of the day, the Americans will be there for the Kurds, not just in Iraq, but also, I believe, certainly in northeast Syria.
Mr. de Mistura, you had a long track record of experience when it comes to Syria as a UN envoy. The key central question for the Syrian Kurds is a different one. Now they are in a very difficult situation. They're certainly controlling less territory in a difficult angle of the country. And they're asking, who should we trust? What should be our next move? Should we go back under the control of Assad? Should we rely on the Americans or just start talking to Russia and see what they want? What is your advice to the Kurds in Syria?
The strongest quality I've seen in my experience about the Kurds is their courage. And the second one has been their determination in wanting to have their culture, religion respected and their own autonomy wherever they could. The weakest is the lack of strategy. So I would like to imagine that this time they use strategic approach. Now, in the current environment in Syria, as General Petraeus very effectively said during the conference, it all depends, your key word, on the seriousness of the consistency of what they are hearing at the moment from the Americans. The American administration seems to be saying that they are staying for a while. They are using, from what I understand, the argument of oil. I want to believe that they have other reasons for doing so, and how long those reasons will be valid. Now, depending on that, if I were the Kurds on the spot, I would then definitely want to hope that the Americans either stay or they help. And now I'm saying something unusual, but I've seen it happening in the past, together with the Russians, in convincing the government of Syria, the government of President Assad, that the Syrian Kurds should be treated with respect, attention, and some degree of autonomy. Either the Americans stay longer, or they use the leverage together with the Russians in convincing the government to actually respect and give that autonomy. And by doing so, protecting them as well. Now, that will probably reassure, because we should never forget, and it's been always a mistake doing so, underestimating the level of paranoia and concern, some, frankly, to a certain degree legitimate, of Turkey about their own security. But that could even address that aspect, because both Russia and the US together would guarantee that in fact the Kurds will not be touched, but will also not go too far if some of them are tempted to provoke that paranoia with the Turks. That could be a win-win, but it's not there yet. So the alternative is for the Americans to stick to their word and not have sudden changes.
Certainly, win-win situation in the Middle East is
Very
very
rare.
difficult, very rare to find. Mr. Kaplan, giving your in-depth understanding of history, vast relationships you have with many leaders in the region, do you think the Kurds should rely on the West for protection? Not just asking for their rights, for protection against genocide or mass killing that happened to them before during Saddam Hussein's time, then afterward in several stages, including with the ISIS war. Do you think they should rely on the West at this point?
I think the Kurds ultimately have to rely upon themselves. And I would agree that what's missing from the Kurdish narrative is two things. First of all, I believe that there should be more cross-border cooperation between Rojava and Iraqi Kurdistan. I think that the time is right for both parties to give a little and to see the opportunities for closer cooperation. That then lends itself into the concept of strategy. The Kurds have to be able to have a strategy that would enable them to withstand the reality that they live in a very difficult neighborhood, and even though they are the largest disenfranchised ethnic group in the world, and probably the one, certainly amongst the others who would like to have a state, who really deserves to be able to have an independent state, nonetheless, we have to accept the reality that they are carved between four very difficult countries. I myself would like to see more cooperation between the Kurds of these four countries, all four countries. That's my personal preference. I believe that the time may be right. This is a period in history in which, with a tweet or a telephone call, an entire region can be thrown into turmoil. We should not assume the status quo is going to hold, and I think that the closeness of the Kurds will allow them to be able to work together in the event that events completely outside of their control or outside of their having created put them in a position where they will have the ability to create a better environment for their own freedom.
And by that you mean independence, by now you mean changing borders, which has been very proven difficult in Middle East after the First World War.
I'm not going to go that far. If you asked me whether an independent Kurdistan would be a force for stability in the Middle East, I would absolutely say it would be. Having said that, I'm not going to encourage people to engage in an exercise that is very dangerous. However, we live in very volatile times, and without having prompted events, there are certain scenarios which I could foresee with regard to Syria, Iraq, and Iran, which, having nothing to do with the Kurds, would result in them being faced, and with regional partners being faced with very different prospects. They may not all be good options, but some of them may be better than others. And I think that if there is an appropriate strategy and we game this out, we will be much better prepared for the things that could happen overnight without any warning.
Mr. Levy, you've been on the ground quite recently with the Kurds in Syria and in Iraq during ISIS war. Based on what you've witnessed, and you are in contact with many Kurds, do you think Kurds in both parts are heading toward a more durable, stable situation, regardless what that would be, especially for the Syrian Kurds, and what framework would be?
First of all, I would like to start with an optimistic note. Something rather significant is happening tonight. We just heard one of the most prestigious, maybe the most prestigious general in the West, David Petraeus. We spoke about Pakistan, Afghanistan, Arab world, geostrategy in general. And we did that. We heard this lecture under the banner of Justice for Kurds. So tonight, Kurds, the Kurdish name, was the umbrella under which the hottest questions of geopolitics of today have been evoked and treated, asked and sometimes replied. This is very important. My dream, I'm saying that why? My dream, and I saw it is also the dream of my chairman, Tom Kaplan. I would love to see one day, before the end of my life, in Erbil or in Kamishli, let's say in Erbil, a real regional security conference dealing with all these topics, radical Islam, refugees, what is a citizen, what is citizen, all these sort of things in a Kurdish capital. And maybe I'm dreaming, but something happens tonight which could lead to this. This is the optimistic note. The pessimistic one is that I heard the replies of my colleagues and friends. Could what has happened to the Syrian Kurds happen to the Iraqi Kurds? But my friends, it happened. Remember September 2017. Remember the Battle of Kirkuk. Remember the Battle of Alton Kupri, where a few Peshmerga commanders resisted the Shia militias backed by Iran, motorized in Abrams tanks, and alas, the Western world did not move one finger. So in reality, what is the most sad aspect of this history is that what happened in Syria a few months ago had been rehearsed. The rehearsal happened in Iraq, in Kurdistan, Iraq, 2 years before. So it is true that this vulnerability of the Kurdish people in front of tragedy, history, ingratitude of the world is a data of history. Now, what can we do? Who are your allies? Who are the allies of the Kurdish people? Women and men of goodwill in high-ranking posts of administration, in public opinion, in the West, and not only in the West. A few days ago, it is not yet really publicized, I was in an Arab capital. I was in Riyadh to speak about the Kurds. The topic of my lecture was, do the Kurds have other friends than mountains? I was speaking in front of an assembly of high dignitaries of Saudi Arabia, who have not been always my friends, far from it. What did I tell them? The Kurds should be the friends, should be the mentors of whoever in the Muslim and Arab world wants to advance on the difficult road of fighting radical Islam and embracing moderate, secular, friendly to women Islam. Whoever in the Arabic world who has this target to make this intellectual and moral reform of Islam should have as a guiding star the experience of the Kurdish people and the brightest aspects of its destiny. So who are your friends? The West, the women and men of goodwill in the West, and same in the Muslim and Arab world. And there should be a great alliance of these two forces in order to sanctuarize, help, defend, protect the Kurds. And this is one of the real targets of Tom Kaplan and myself in our undertaking Justice for Kurds.
Yeah, well, absolutely. As a Kurd, I witnessed that when it comes to Justice for Kurds and your advocacy here in the U.S. And, you know, the moral question, that moral argument you're making, you know, for me as a Kurd, you know, my bias here is very clear. General Petraeus, you being one of the greatest minds when it comes to geopolitics, I want to ask you this time a question about this moral argument. Do you think, regardless of the calculation of the alliance in the Middle East by the Western powers, especially United States, do you think there is a moral duty to protect the Kurds and advance their cause in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think there's a moral obligation. I think we have felt that all along. Let's not forget who it was that really protected the Kurds from 1991 all the way until the takedown of the Saddam Hussein regime, the liberation of the rest of Iraq. Because again, the Kurdish region was doing quite well. Keep in mind, again, as a young two-star division commander with the headquarters in Mosul, I was responsible for the Kurdish region, which didn't need much help, frankly. We provided some assistance and so forth. But again, that obligation had been discharged already for well over a decade. And I think it has been over the years since as well. Although clearly there have been times where we were too slow in pursuing a no-fly and no-drive zone in particular in northern Syria. And again, not just for the Syrian Kurds, but for the Syrian Sunni and other individuals who were being treated so horrifically by the Bashar al-Assad regime, keeping in mind that over 500,000 Syrians have been killed, half of the entire population displaced, and half of them outside the country. And certainly that, I think, there's a humanitarian component to that. But the truth is, at the end of the day, as I mentioned during the session prior to this interview, it comes down to a degree of realpolitik, if you will. It comes down to, okay, what are the security interests for the citizens of the United States, our allies in Europe, and so forth. And I think beyond the moral obligation, you can make a very compelling case that we should have a sustained commitment in that particular region, but not just there, but in other areas in the Middle East. But it has to be sustainable. And the measure of sustainability is the expenditure of blood and treasure, of lives lost, and of the cost for our country. I believe that that is very affordable. I think it is an imperative, actually, but that's what we have to convince the American public, which understandably is very much eager to see, keen to see the end of endless wars. And by the way, no one wants to see that more than those who have actually been fighting the endless wars, those in uniform. So you have to have a very convincing argument, again, about the concrete objectives of this in security terms and perhaps some other terms, even as you obviously also advance the humanitarian aspects, and again, as we put it, the actual moral obligation that I think we continue to have to people of the region, including the Iraqi and Syrian Kurds.
Well, two key developments recently has been the news about potentially deploying Patriot missile system in Kurdistan region. And the argument was by Pentagon is to protect the US forces from potential Iranian attacks. And there has been a meeting between President of Kurdistan region, Ecevit Barzani, and President Trump. Do you see this development as a sign of potential, at least, commitment for the next few years by the US to protect Kurdistan region, or this is totally about the calculation of Trump administration with regard to Iran, deterring Iran in Iraq?
Well, if you talk specifically about Patriot missile, anti-ballistic missile systems and so forth, and anti-aircraft, I mean, that is for force protection is typically the argument. The challenge there is that there is a limited number of these Patriot battalions in the world. We'd actually gotten a lot of them out of the Middle East region, and now have been putting them back in. Keep in mind that we have put tens of thousands of additional American soldiers back into the overall region, particularly the Gulf states. Whether the calculation of we can put them there or somewhere else, and keep in mind that there are needs for Patriot batteries and battalions in many other places in the world, not the least of which is on the Korean Peninsula. But that shouldn't be the measure of merit. What's much more important is, do our forces on the ground, particularly our special operations forces, and particularly within that, our counterterrorism capabilities that are augmented by all of these intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that proved so important in enabling the Iraqi security forces, Peshmerga, Syrian Democratic Forces, and so forth, to defeat the Islamic State as an army and to take away its caliphate, noting that there are still 20 to 30,000 Islamic State fighters as insurgents and as terrorist cells. And so I think the real question is actually much more about that kind of capability than it is the defensive capability about a potential further missile strike from Iran.
Okay, with that we will go to a short break and come back to talk more. بینەران و بیسەرانی خۆشەویستی ڕوودا و دەچینە ناو بڕێکی کورت و پاشان دەگەڕێنەوە لاتان. بینەران و بیسەرانی خۆشەویستی ڕوودا و گەڕاینەوە لاتان بۆ ئەم دیدارە تایبەتەی تۆڕی میدیایی ڕوودا و لە زانکۆی یەڵی ئەمریکاوە لە شاری نیوهێڤنەوە کە لەگەڵ نێردەی پێشووی نەتەوەیە گرتووەکان ستێفان دیمەستورە و هەروەها ژەنڕاڵ دەیڤید پەترێوس کە بەرپرسی پێشووی دەستگای هەواڵگری CIA و هەروەها بەرپرسی هێزەکانی هاوپەیمانان بوو لە ئەفغانستان و عێراقیش و هەروەها لەگەڵ بەڕێز تۆم کاپلان کە سەرۆکی گەورەترین ڕێکخراوی پشگیریکردنە لە کورد لە ئەمریکا ڕێکخراوی JFK و هەروەها نووسەر و فەیلسوفی فەڕەنسی بەناوبانگ بێرنارد هێنری لێڤی. Now going back to the topic of the Kurds in Syria. So Dimasura, when it's come to diplomacy, right now we notice that this administration, Trump administration, there has been a rapprochement with the Kurds, Iraqi Kurds especially. And the vice president going to Erbil, visiting and without going to Baghdad, we are seeing these bilateral meeting between President Trump and President of Kurdistan region. Do you think Kurds should are reading too much into this? Do you think this is because of a decision by this administration or a change of policy that relies more on the Kurds in Iraq, or this is something else?
I've seen over the years how, in fact, the Kurds became important when they were useful to the security of the West. It's human, frankly. That's a realpolitik, okay? So the strongest argument is yours, the one you made. General Petraeus was making it about the fact that the best strategy, if you want to be tactical here, is for the Kurds to remind what we just heard. There are still 22,000 Daesh people, dangerous. They are dangerous to the US. In fact, they are linked to those who did 9/11. They are dangerous to Paris, Bataclan. They are dangerous to Brussels, to London, to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, to Stockholm, to Montreal, to Quebec, to anywhere. Okay, these guys are dangerous. Well, the ones who have been mostly effective on the ground, not in the air, but on the ground, look at the victims, have been Kurdish forces. In case in Syria situation changes, where will the US go? To Iraq. And where would they be better placed? Probably in northern Iraq, where the Kurds are. The logistics for all that comes through Erbil and other places. Bottom line, yes, moral. But you know, in politics, and I feel terribly sad to say so, politics sometimes don't pay much attention to moral. We wish they would so. That's why civil society and advocacy is so important, the one you're doing. But it's also realpolitik. Bottom line, you can, and you should say more and more, we are the best at the moment to guarantee to you, to Russia, who don't want to have Al-Qaeda, even to others, to Arab countries who don't want to have Al-Qaeda, and to the West, to actually protect you from that.
Absolutely. And, you know, as a Kurd and student of history,
how many died for that?
Yeah, exactly.
12,000?
The realpolitics so far seems to be a ruling in the Middle East in general, not just about the Kurds. That dynamic is very obvious. But I want to add...
Let me put out, though, as well, even after the Islamic State, if it is completely eliminated, which I think is unlikely, but even if the forces are reduced very, very considerably, as we did with the Al-Qaeda in Iraq elements when Stefan and I were in Baghdad, privileged to work together, you still need a presence. And I argued with Prime Minister Maliki that you need to keep an eye on Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They are down, but they are not out. And of course, they were able to get back on their feet as the Islamic State, to drift into Syria, to gain a lot of additional power, forces, commanders, weapons, vehicles, and money, and sweep back into Iraq and make short work of the Iraqi security forces in the north and in much of Anbar province as well. So again, it's about keeping an eye on this. So the success would be you could actually draw down that force considerably, but still keep it and partner it with those forces that are the most effective. And those are clearly those of the Peshmerga, and also, to be fair, the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service, the Iraqi Counterterrorism Force in particular within that, and some of the other special operations forces of Iraq, which did perform quite heroically in the fight against the Islamic State at the beginning, and then definitely in the counteroffensive.
Absolutely, and you know, that's exactly what happened on the ground, as we saw in 2014, the result of the withdrawal of 2011. But many Kurds, and I have this question for both of you, as you are basically right now, I can attest as a Kurdish journalist running the most effective lobbying and advocacy effort in the US. Kurds are asking this question, is like, we are not just fighters. We are not just, we are a nation with, you know, with a long history. We want to live normally like other nations in the region. And for that, in order to get something more than being useful for the West, there has to be more. And I guess for that goal, you need the public support. Then the moral calculation might affect the decision-making process in the capital. Where are we when it comes to that in the US? You know, we saw these incredible, as a Kurd, I've never seen this amount of support for Kurds anywhere outside of Kurdistan that I saw after the Turkish operation started back in October. How do you see and describe the support from the US public to the Kurdish issue and cause? here in the US? And this question for both of you.
I think that, shall I begin? I think that what we've witnessed post the decision to effectively give the Kurds to the Turks was a transcendent moment in the history of the modern Kurdish people. I can tell you that that day I happened to be in Washington, D.C., and had dinner with a very senior official. And when he came to the table, it's just a few of us, I said to him, we have a lot of things to discuss this evening about the region. I'm not going to spend too much time beating you up on what just happened today, for a very simple reason. I don't believe that anyone with intelligence, with decency, with honor, or a soul could possibly have supported that decision. But I will tell you this, sir. As the chairman of an organization called Justice for Kurds, I hope you had the shittiest day of your entire life, because this will be a stain on the honor of our country for at least a generation. Now, there are two aspects to this. One, of course, is the usefulness aspect of what the Kurds represent, which, by the way, the official then went on to tell me, basically repeating everything that I would have said to him. We always talk about having our allies step up and carry more of the burden. We call it burden sharing, that they will do more of the fighting on the ground and allow the United States to be able to use the assets that it has, being the preeminent superpower, and therefore be able to have a more equitable balance of responsibilities and sacrifice. The Kurds, as we've heard many times, they lost 12,000 dead, maybe more, 23,000 wounded. They managed to succeed in taking 30% of Syria, and in the process making Iranian calculations as they're building their corridor to the sea, one of the seas. They've made it to the Red Sea as well as to the Mediterranean. The Kurds were our allies, and for this, America lost perhaps 10 people. If that isn't the epitome, if that does not suggest the paradigm of burden sharing, of America's having an ally who not only sacrifices for the common cause, but wins, then I don't really know what is. But this is only part of the story. A nation's policies, especially when you're a superpower, must reside not solely on shared interests, but on shared values. The fact that the Kurds were able to accomplish these incredible feats on the military battlefield, and at the same time managed to create within the areas that they control the freest, the most fair society in those regions, is an extraordinary statement. In any other part of that region, martial law would have been declared. There would have been no rights, no freedom. Women would not have been given the emancipation. You would not have had any religious tolerance. You'd have had none of it. The Kurds fought, they won, and they did so nobly. This is extraordinary. This is why Justice for Kurds existed. And we pre-exist what happened to the Syrian Kurds. We exist because we have a debt of gratitude to the Kurdish people, and more than that, we have the shared values and the shared interests that should make us enduring partners for all time.
Bernard, has the argument of values and morality in international politics in general, do you think that ever been a determining factor when it's come to international politics anywhere? And this might be like a very general philosophical question, but you are the right man to ask about philosophy right here.
Let me first reply to finishing reply to your previous questions about at which point are you in the world in terms of popularity. You said that you. I want to I remember something when I listened to you. When I started my movie, Peshmerga, this road movie crossing the 1,000 kilometers of front line between ISIS and the Kurds in 2015. Okay, the 6 months I spent there. When I started, at least in France, but I think in Europe, and I think in many circles in America, people did not really knew what a Peshmerga was. And I will confess something to you. Even myself, before starting the movie, before engaging myself with my crew, I had not a completely clear, it's true, idea of that. I thought that Peshmerga was a common name for Syrian fighters and Iraqi fighters, which means that today, such a road has been done. You can go everywhere in America and in Europe, people know. They know about Peshmerga, they know about Kurdish history, they know about Kurdish values. There is an extent, a content of a level of knowledge unprecedented, which is a great path. Now values. For me, I think that, and I join, as always, Tom Kaplan on that. For real grand powers, for real democracy, what characterizes a democracy is that values and interest in a way or in another match. What is the definition of a democracy? Opposed to a theocracy, to an autocracy, to a dictatorship, to a totalitarian regime. This idea that at least they should match. They don't always match, but they should match. So there is the matching. About our purpose of tonight, the Kurds. For me, there are three different reasons to be solidar to the Kurds. Number one, boots on the ground, sure. But you are right, you are not only soldiers. You are not only our boots on the ground. Number two, pole of stability. If really our values and our interest is to have a stable Middle East, we know, it's obvious, that dictatorship is a source of instability and that democracy is always not the mechanical condition but a source of stability. So we have, in terms of value and in terms of interest, we have to support the Kurds. Reason number two, for stability. We have Israel, which is a pole of stability, and we have the KRG, we have the Rojava. And number three, what I said before, today there is one challenge in the world, one huge challenge, that will occupy probably the life of our children and grandchildren, which is what will happen to Islam. Either Islam goes in the way of enlightenment, reform, as Christianity did, as Judaism did, one way, or it goes to radicalism the other way. Radicalism will mean hell. Enlightenment will mean a breathing for the whole world. In order to go against radicalism and to go on the road of moderation, we need some the world, the Islamic world, needs some examples. Not example in terms in moral terms, needs the proof that it is possible. Kurdistan is the proof, the living proof, the vibrant proof that a democratic Islam is possible. So, I don't mean that you are a laboratory. You are much more than that. But anyone, I see that in my country, in France. A lot of people ask that, but is Islam compatible with democracy? Yes or no? Reply, the Kurds. Answer, the Kurds. Look at the Kurds. You can be Muslim, you can be a pious Muslim, a true Muslim, and respect the equality with women, respect democracy, protect the minorities, having an office for the protection of Jews, even if you don't have Jews in the KRG, and so on. So all these reasons are a sort of a series of reasons which, in terms of value plus interests, should move us, direct us in helping much more the Kurds, which we are all of us trying to do tonight and before and tomorrow.
And I'm sure many Kurds would hope that that U.S. decision makers, at least part of them, see it this way, that the way you see it. General Petraeus, when it's come to Iraq, right now Iraq is unraveling again in the post-ISIS. We are seeing, for the first time, the Shiite population is rejecting the post-Saddam Hussein political process. A direct confrontation between US and Iran, although it's not a total war, but just this week there was rocket attacks on K1 base in Kirkuk. How do you see the situation playing out in Iraq, and what do you think the Kurds in particular, since we are talking about the Kurds, should play their cards, as they say?
Well, first of all, I think it's beyond inexplicable. It's terrible that the second largest OPEC oil producer cannot provide enough electricity to its citizens. And it is likewise terrible that the land of the two rivers cannot provide adequate drinking water to all of its citizens. So I think the protesters on the street have very legitimate and very understandable grievances. And that is what they have been demonstrating about. And plus the corruption, the nepotism, the division of politics and so forth by different agreements among the ruling parties and so forth. My hope is that Prime Minister designate Alawi, who still has to form a government and have it approved by the parliament, is sufficiently sensitive to these issues and also to the issues of the concerns of the protesters that Iraq has become the 51st state of Iran, if you will. In other words, it's so heavily under the influence of Iran as to be surrendering a good bit of its sovereignty. Now, that's the hope, and again, hope often ends up in tough places in Iraq, where Ambassador Crocker and I used to say that in Iraq it's all hard all the time, but then I added, but hard is not hopeless. What can the Kurds do? Well, they are doing. For number one, it's a Kurd who is the president of Iraq, who is trying to help this government formation process, who's obviously got very close relationships. I just saw the prime minister of the Kurdish region in Munich. They're working very hard to try to help the formation of this government, understandably ensuring that their interests are represented in Baghdad, which is hugely important given that relationship and the importance of it in terms of resources for the KRG. And then again, trying to use its influence, which is considerable. Let's keep in mind that the place that everyone in Iraq goes to when threatened, whether you are Sunni, Shia, or Kurds, is to Erbil and perhaps Sulaymaniyah. And so again, there is this stability that is there that again can be an example for Baghdad. Although, to be fair to those in Baghdad, the challenges of the Iraqi state are just extraordinary. And I learned this also very early on in Nainawa province, where you not only have a Sunni Arab majority, you have a sizable Kurdish minority. And by the way, there's KDP and PUK. There are Yazidis, there are Arab Shia, there's Shia Turkmen, there are Shabak, there are Christians. Again, that was Iraq in a microcosm in one province, and then multiply this many times over, and you have the challenges that have to be dealt with in Baghdad. But it's also a country that has these extraordinary blessings, an exceptional amount of resources. As we learned when we helped Iraq rebuild its energy industry and its electricity and all the rest of this, there's enormous capacity there, education, a willingness to work, technical ability, and all the rest of that. And my hope, again, is that Baghdad can get it right this time. It is listening to the protesters on the streets, and that it can forge a way forward that does provide the kind of basic services, the kind of rule of law, the kind of economic opportunity that all Iraqis should have. And again, they can look to the KRG for an example of what they might have for the entire country.
And my last question to you, Mr. de Mistura, about the Kurds in Syria. When it comes to the political process, I think every press conference almost at the UN, I would ask you the same question: why Kurds are not involved in Geneva? Why they are not in the process? If you could tell us, I mean, we know why, Turkish pressure, but if you could tell us if there was actual American or European pressure to say, include the Kurds in that process, in that UN-led process, which you led and engineered, and also, how do you see it in future? Do you think the Kurds could have part of whatever political outcome, I dare to say Assad-led the political outcome that it will have in the future?
Let's say government of Syria, United Syria led. You're asking me the same question, and you're right, and now I think I can answer it. You see, there is no doubt that 3.5, 3.8 million Syrian people, because the Kurds are Syrian Kurds, should have a saying in the future of the country and to be part of the writing of a new constitution, which should be giving freedom and space for every minority or majority, the Sunni majority, for instance, and the Kurds. And not only the Kurds, there are many others. So there is no doubt on that. So I thought about how to get the Kurds on board. But you're right, Turkey was opposing it. They were telling me the Kurds are already represented in the government, and if the Kurds want to be part of a delegation, they should be part of the government delegation. The Kurds did not want to be part of that delegation. And it's true, it's true, both US and Russia believe it. Told me, Mr. de Mistura, please convince the Turks about having the Kurds represented into the Constitutional Committee. And I said, sorry, did I hear well? Two superpowers are asking the UN to actually tell Turkey to do what the two superpowers are not willing or able to do. Obviously, that was a non-starter. So my answer was, the time will come, and it will come. And the Kurds listened to that, and that's why they didn't complain. They had other priorities, by the way. And they knew that one day, when the Constitutional Committee will generally start working, which is not the case, we have been pushing for it, that time the Kurds cannot be ignored.
Absolutely. And you think that then they can be involved? That's what you mean?
No, I don't think they can. They must.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's absolutely an honor. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.